Aloha kako and welcome to our final Botany 105 review. First, some clarity on terms. Botany, as you know, is the study of plants. Anything about plants. How and where they grow, how they photosynthesize, how they evolve, how to conserve them. All of these terms fall under the umbrella of botany. Economic botany is a term used to describe the scientific study of how people use plants. Economic botanists focus on the interaction of people and plants, and often, but not always, focus on economic values of these plants. Ethnobotany is a branch of economic botany that also studies how people use plants. However, ethnobotanists typically focus on the traditional knowledge and the cultural importance of plants within a region. Other somewhat related terms that we've used this year include agronomy, the science of soil management and crop management, and horticulture, the science of garden cultivation and landscape management. Even if you never heard of it before this year, ethnobotany is important. Indigenous peoples hold generations of intimate knowledge about the natural world, including plants, and many indigenous groups live in and steward some of the most important ecosystems on Earth. Our systems of knowledge are also threatened by viruses and cultural and economic changes, and they deserve to be preserved. Hopefully you enjoyed learning from fellow Kamehameha graduate Dr. Isabella Abbott. She has inspired generations of young Hawaiians to deeply consider the important role of plants in the perpetuation of our culture. Okay, let's review. The remote areas of the Pacific Ocean, pictured in the map to the right, were some of the last areas on Earth to be colonized by humans. The many islands of Polynesia are somewhat defined by the triangle in the map. The Polynesian peoples and their unique cultures developed through a series of migrations, generally from west to east. Natural resources, many of them plants, provide evidence of travel routes and interactions among Pacific peoples over thousands of years. Plants, many of them endemic, played key roles in the development of the unique cultures that developed in these geographically isolated island groups. The first peoples to colonize the Indo-Pacific arrived in the area some 50,000 years ago, during the Pleistocene era. During this period of increased glaciation, the Papuan peoples may have walked over land bridges that existed at the time, or made short trips between the islands in simple canoes. Over the years, they domesticated local plants including taro, yams, sugarcane, tea, turmeric, and bananas. These plants became important sources of food and material culture in the area and were spread throughout the world. Tens of thousands of years later, about 6,000 years before present, another group entered the Indo-Pacific area from current-day Taiwan. This seafaring group, called the Austronesians, arrived on canoes and brought new crops with them: rice, paper mulberry, breadfruit, and ava. Over the next 3,000 years, the Austronesians developed a unique culture and economy in the area, marked by a distinctive kind of pottery called lapita. They developed advanced canoe and navigation technologies, and eventually carried a new set of crops and other important plants to Easter Island in the east and as far as Madagascar to the west. Austronesian voyagers left near Oceania about 3,000 years ago and traveled to ever-distant islands in the Pacific. They quickly reached the islands of Western Samoa at the western tip of the Polynesian Triangle, where there was a pause in voyaging for over 2,000 years. It is during this period that a unique Polynesian identity and culture emerged. Then, about 800 years ago, long-distance voyaging resumed, and Easter Island, New Zealand, and Hawaii were colonized within short order. So how do we know this stuff? Our current picture of colonization routes and timetables is informed by many independent lines of evidence as listed here, including plants and plant use. Take, for example, bananas in the genus Musa. Bananas were domesticated by Papuan peoples and are counted among the first of domesticated fruit trees. There are several lines of banana that were developed, including plantains and maoli lines shown here on the left. Their spread throughout the world gives us insight into travel routes and economies in the past, as shown in the figure to the right. Of the 100 or so important plants used for food and culture near Oceania, only 40 seem to have made it out to Hawaii. These plants can be grouped into a few major categories: foods, medicines, construction materials, and clothing, with many plants serving multiple purposes. How were these plants transported over the vast Pacific Ocean? As seen on the left, most of these plants were propagated asexually and were presumably transported as cuttings or vegetative propagules. Many of the tree species, shown on the right, were presumably propagated as seeds. These plants would take months to years to reach maturity in their new home. When humans first reached the Hawaiian Archipelago some 1,000 years ago, they found an array of ecosystems that had been evolving for tens of millions of years in isolation. The Hawaiian Islands were much younger and larger than other islands in the Pacific, with ample fresh water and numerous endemic plant species. We spent quite a bit of time going over these incredible native ecosystems earlier in this semester, which are shown here on the right. The first human colonizers began to alter the lowland environments and to establish their transported landscapes. In the meanwhile, they sustained themselves with wild foods. Some of these important wild food sources are listed below. Despite abundant fish, marine invertebrates, and birds, there were relatively few plant resources that would have been available as foods. For example, Hawaii has no large native land animals for dispersal, and therefore no large fruit species. Hawaiians utilized more species of limu in their traditional diets than other Polynesian groups, perhaps because of the extreme isolation of the archipelago and the need to exploit these wild foods. The task of limu collection and preparation typically fell to women, perhaps because most limu were not subject to any religious restrictions. Dr. Abbott considers limu the third major component of the traditional diet, along with fish and poi. Limu could be eaten as a condiment or used as a flavorful thickener in a variety of dishes cooked in the imu. Many species were also useful as medicines. The original population of humans in Hawaii rose exponentially, as evidenced by the number of house sites in Leeward, Hawaii, shown to the left, and Kaho'olawe, shown to the right. The archaeologist Patrick Perch divides this growth curve into distinct stages, which is discussed at length last quarter. Please review the major events of each stage and the relative lengths of each stage prior to taking the final exam. By the time Captain Cook arrived in Hawaii in 1778, the Hawaiian population had been thriving for 1,000 years. Windward Valleys were dedicated to kane and had been converted into systems of ponded fields for growing kalo and associated plants. Most of us are familiar with this type of landscape from our years of work at Punalu'u. The picture here is from Kanewai at UH Manoa. The Leeward Slopes of the islands were converted into what are called Kona field systems, as depicted in this drawing of Kona from 1836. These rain-fed farm systems were dependent on lono, and included vast groves of ulu trees and stone terracing for capturing water for ko and uala. A drone shot over South Kohala reveals how extensive these systems were. You can still see remnants of terrace walls under the introduced ranch grasses. Coastlines were also heavily altered in many areas and converted into fish ponds, like Heiaia Fish Pond, shown here to the left. Here people could control the mixing of salt and fresh waters to create the perfect mix for growing limu and raising fish. This unique Hawaiian innovation allowed people to increase the productivity of near-shore waters by orders of magnitude. Hawaiians utilized almost all the lowlands around the archipelago, as shown in this map of Kau from the 1930s. They had also developed a highly effective management system for natural resources, based on economic and political land divisions, and strict rules and protocols for resource extraction. Early Hawaiians also developed new resources, many of which came from the numerous native plants that preceded them to the islands. The endemic plant olona is shown here. Last quarter, we discussed the role that native plants played in the shaping of a unique Hawaiian cultural identity. Traditional land management and farming methods were very productive, and as foods became plentiful in ancient Hawaii, the arts also thrived. Hawaiians were known to possess expertise in many arts, and we spent a great part of our distance learning program exploring some of them. Unfortunately, only fragments of this knowledge remain, but more on that later. Ancient Hawaiians were masters of plant anatomy. Like their ancestors before them, they realized that the long and elastic fibers associated with the inner bark of certain plants could be fashioned into clothing or cordage. Here we see the fibers that is separated from the branch of a hau bush. They give the woody stem elastic strength. Kapa is made primarily from the bast fibers of the Polynesian-introduced Brosonetia papyrifera, or wauke. The inner bark of young trees was removed, cleaned and fermented, and pounded into a felted bark cloth. Hawaiians grew their wauke close together and removed side branches as shown in the photo. This produced large pieces of poundable bark without holes. There were a number of other plants involved in the production of kapa. Beaters were made of hardwoods like kauila or kauaia, and the anvil was fashioned from plants like nanu, the native gardenia. Stamps and brushes were made from ohe and hala, and dyes and mordants were made from a wide variety of plant extracts. We spent quite a bit of time learning about this craft, which has experienced a resurgence in recent years. Please review your Chapter 7 worksheet prior to taking the final. Also fashioned from the bast fibers of plants, or sometimes from the fibers of the coconut fruit, is Hawaiian cordage. Just as in the manufacture of kapa, the inner bark of certain plants was fermented, cleaned, and dried. Strips of fibers were twisted or braided in different ways to fashion cordage. Cordage was used for the making of all manner of implements, and was essential for survival in traditional times. First among the Hawaiians' cordage resources was the endemic olona, a forest plant that produced cordage strong enough for weapons and deep-sea fishing. Olona is the second strongest natural fiber in the world. To the right we see an old hook from a collection at the Bishop Museum, and the cordage here is made from olona. Aha, or cordage made from the coconut husk, was also highly valued in ancient times and used widely throughout society. We watched a video on the processing of hau cordage earlier this quarter. Please review your Chapter 8 worksheet prior to taking the final. As Dr. Abbott suggests, Hawaiians were in relatively good health at the time of Western contact. They led active lives, ate organic foods, and lived in clean environments. They viewed sickness as having spiritual as well as physical causes, and foods and medicines as two sides of the same coin. Hopefully you're able to watch some of the videos with Liban Ohai and Auntie Lynette. They give you insight into the way La'au Laba'au still works today. I was trained that Hawaiian healing involves 80% prayer, and the rest is plants. Most of the plants used as medicines in traditional times were Polynesian introduced, as in this list from Chapter 13. Many of these plants, as well as other introduced plants, are also the basis of modern-day healing practices, as you saw in the videos. Please review your Chapter 13 worksheet prior to taking the final. This week you read the afterword of our text, Changes in Plant Use After 1820. The rapid decline of the Hawaiian population due to introduced diseases, coupled with the cultural upheaval that followed the death of Kamehameha Nui, led to the loss of untold knowledge and expertise. Most traditional knowledge in the crafts listed here was all but lost by 1920, well before even my time. It bears repeating that nearly all of the plants and all of the traditions described in our course remain alive in various localities and families throughout our Pai'aina. As Dr. Abbott reminds us, these plants and traditions will only endure with very strong efforts to keep them alive. I have worked to identify, propagate, and replant native plants that form the foundation of our material culture. Which traditions will you keep alive? Finally, I hope that you've enjoyed this year as much as I have, despite all the events and challenges of the fourth quarter. Please continue to grow plants and learn from them. Not only is this good for the planet, but it's good for you too. Just as I learned to recognize each of you, enjoy your presence, and appreciate your talents, I have also taken the time to do likewise with the plants around our classroom. They have become like friends, and help me to connect to nature, my cultural past, and future generations as well. Some of them are useful for making things, some taste good or are medicines, some do weird stuff to your mind and body. Some are embodiments of gods and ancestors from times long past, and many of them will hopefully outlive me to experience and teach generations of students to come. Mahalo ke akua.